Previously on The Amazing Spider-Man, high schooler Peter Parker gained unique abilities after being bitten by an irradiated spider. He has the ability to walk on walls, he has exceptional agility, he has the chance to lift many times his own body weight, and he gets a tingle at the base of his skull whenever danger is in the vicinity. It acts as a precognitive sense. Also, that spider went on to build a South Korean exchange student named Sydney Moon, but that's another story for another time.
Parker would begin utilizing his new powers for fame and fortune, going as far as to create a costume along with specialized gauntlets that contained a synthesized webbing fluid. Dubbing himself Spider-Man, Parker would appear at professional wrestling shows as well as several TV variety series. Unfortunately, that would be short-lived, as Parker would return home one night to find that his Uncle Ben, who had raised Peter since his parents' death alongside his Aunt May, had surprised an armed burglar when returning home from a walk. The burglar shot and killed Ben, leading an irate Peter to track him down, only to discover that this was an individual Parker could have stopped earlier when the TV studio was held up. Thus, Peter would learn Peter moves on to a life of crime fighting, taking on the likes of the Master of Disguise, the Chameleon, Living Battery Electro, Septuagenarian Aerialist, the Vulture, Dr. Octopus, who's telepathically linked to a group of mechanical arms, and the Sandman, whose body can take either the form of sand or even turn as hard as a rock.
Spidey would also go on to face the terrible Tinkerer, the Living Brain, a malfunctioning supercomputer that also was a robot, and perhaps lamest of all, the trio of Montana, Fancy Dan, and Ox, aka the Enforcers, a group of mob goons who really didn't do much. Hopefully we'll never see those guys ever again.
Peter is able to earn some income by selling pictures of his antics as Spider-Man to the Daily Bugle newspaper, whose publisher, J. Jonah Jameson, is one of the Wallcrawler's biggest detractors. Peter also hits it off with Jameson's secretary, Betty Brant, who seems to have a few secrets of her own.
What happens next? Well, let's find out in the Marvel Masterworks presents The Amazing Spider-Man, Volume 2.
Peter sits in his bedroom worried, as at the end of the previous issue he saw Betty getting into a stranger's car before leaving town. Further complicating matters, the reports come over the radio that Dr. Octopus is about to be released from prison. Peter dons his Spider-Man outfit and heads to the prison to question the warden about what's going on. The warden explains that Dr. Octopus is getting time off for good behavior, and so he's getting But the warden reveals that Dr. Octopus served his sentence and he's getting time off for good behavior. So there's really nothing that can be done. Of course, that doesn't exactly mean that Dr. Octopus is all clean and good now. In fact, he's actually been working on improving his relationship with his additional appendages and developing their fighting skills. However, Peter has been at work too, developing a spider-shaped tracking device that he can hopefully attach onto the vehicle that's driving Ock away from prison, which just happened to be driven by none other than Betty Brant. He also finds a drop map to the city of Philadelphia and deduces that's where the two are heading. In Philly, we meet attorney Bennett Brant, Betty's brother, and his client, mobster Blackie Glaxton. Bennett is in debt to Blackie thanks to a gambling compulsion. In order to clear said debt, he has to do exactly what Blackie says, and Blackie wants him to enlist the aid of Dr. Octopus to help Glaxton spring from prison and then skip the country. Peter tells Aunt May that he's planning on doing some sightseeing in Philly over the weekend and heads off. He uses Spider Tracer to track down Betty, explaining that Jameson heard that Spider-Man was in the city of brotherly love, and so he got sent to take some pictures. Betty explains the whole situation with her brother Bennett, and that Dr. Octopus has already broken Glaxton out of prison. Peter is able to use his Spider Tracer to locate the ship the mobster is using to skip the country, and it's there that Glaxton reveals to Bennett that he has absolutely no plan of canceling the attorney's debt.
Wow, a mobster turned out to be untrustworthy. Who'd have thunk it?
Spidey attempts to crash into the boat, but twists his ankle on the landing, forcing him to think of some creative ways to take on Ock and the other gangsters. He tells the Brants to get to safety, but Bennett spies the Wallcrawler's limp and heads back inside, where he's immediately shot and killed by a stray bullet from Glaxton's gun. Betty lashes out at Spider-Man, who tries to calm her down as he takes on Glaxton. That just leaves Dr. Octopus, who's learned Spider-Man's tactics from their previous battles. However, Ock spots Glaxton's crew trying to run off with his payment, and Betty as well, and decides to try to take after them instead. He eventually hitches the ride on a passing yacht when he grabs his briefcase full of money. Spidey tackles Ock off the vessel, and the two disappear into the river. Glaxton winds up confessing everything to the police, absolving Betty of any wrongdoing, but all in all, it's a loss as she now blames Spider-Man for Bennett's death. Added to that, his injured ankle and the fact that Dr. Octopus is still out there, and Peter is not exactly in high spirits as he heads back to New York City. Betty takes the next 2 weeks off of work, and Jameson is forced to run through temp secretary after temp secretary. She returns ready to work and possibly to resume affections with Peter. Unfortunately, he's starting to come down with a cold.
Okay, I mentioned this last time, but just to reiterate, there are no laws being broken here. Betty is about 17 years old, while Peter is like 15 to 16 at this point. I think he just turned 16. Betty dropped out of high school to replace her mother as J. Jonah Jameson's personal secretary due to said mother developing early onset dementia. So, again, there's not that big an age difference between the two.
The peace is short-lived as Dr. Octopus breaks into the office and abducts Betty. He'll only turn her over when Spider-Man arrives for a showdown on Coney Island. Jameson is forced to print a special edition of the Bugle to get the word out to the wall crawler. Spidey arrives and begins fighting with Dr. Octopus. Unfortunately, Peter's illness, coupled with his injured ankle, have left him in no shape to fight Dr. Octopus, and soon the villain overwhelms Peter, rendering him unconscious. Octopus then removes Spider-Man's mask, revealing Peter Parker's identity to the public. However, the revelation convinces Dr. Octopus that this can't possibly be Spider-Man. After all, why did he beat him so easily? A dazed Peter collaborates this by saying that he was just trying to save Betty. Ock leaves, threatening another showdown with the wall crawler at a later point. 24 hours later, and Peter is feeling much better, though he still winds up getting a ton lashing from Aunt May over his little stunt. Still, several of his classmates hail him as a hero, with the only exception being Flash Thompson, his erstwhile nemesis. However, all of this gets interrupted by news that Dr. Octopus has implemented a new idea to lure Spider-Man out by freeing several animals from the Central Park Zoo. Spider-Man manages to ensnare a lion, a wolf, and a gorilla. Unfortunately, the penguins wind up giving him the slip.
Cute and cuddly boys!
Finally comes the showdown with Dr. Octopus. The two fight near a smokestack before eventually crashing into an art museum where a fire breaks out. Spidey is forced to use his webbing to protect himself to get out of the burning building. Unfortunately, Doc Ock winds up passing out due to all the smoke inhalation. EMS workers eventually turn the still alive octopus over to the police, and Spider-Man's hero reputation is seemingly restored. That is, until a few weeks later, when the wall crawler is spotted breaking into and robbing a jewelry store, burning up whatever goodwill he had. Funny thing is that Peter can't seem to remember doing any of this. On the plus side, Spider-Man does still have one defender, Flash Thompson. Added to all of this, Aunt May mentions some financial problems, and the next day, Peter wakes up to the report of another Spider-Man robbery taking place. Spider-Man is so upset that he decides to visit a psychiatrist to see if it's possible to commit crimes in a somnambulistic state. However, the fear of revealing his identity makes Peter change his mind, and work isn't going too much better, as the only way Jameson's going to pay any type of advance is if Peter can turn up pictures of Spider-Man actually committing these crimes. Peter can't even go web-slinging, as the public just starts attacking him. After yet another Spider-Man robbery, an individual steps forward to assist law enforcement. His name is Mysterio, and he believes that he has the power to counteract Spider-Man's abilities. Jameson is impressed enough that he prints a special edition of the Bugle with an offer to Spider-Man to meet Mysterio at the top of the George Washington Brooklyn Bridge. The two meet that night, and Mysterio is able to use his illusory powers to override Peter Parker's spider sense. He even dissolves the wall crawler's webbing on contact. Mysterio then creates a fog which disorients Spider-Man to the point that he's easily knocked off the bridge and down into the water below. Parker's defeated, but he has managed to piece together what's happening. The general public, especially J. Jonah Jameson, celebrates Mysterio as the new hero for our age. There's just one dissenter, Flash Thompson. When Peter Parker finally meets Mysterio, he slips a spider tracer onto his cape. Peter is so focused that he completely ignores Betty, who's having concerns about this blonde that she saw Peter talking with earlier.
The blonde is Liz Allen, Flash Thompson's girlfriend, who often flirts with Peter to get a rise out of Flash. Although the two eventually do break up, she never exactly starts a relationship with Peter. They just kind of become good friends.
Spider-Man tracks down Mysterio's location and winds up getting toppled again. However, this time he manages to get Mysterio to admit the truth. The Master of Illusion is Quentin Beck, a Hollywood effects artist wanting more recognition and money, who used his knowledge to replicate Spider-Man's powers. So yes, he is behind the rash of Spider-Man-themed robberies. That's all Peter really needed, as it turns out he brought along a tape recorder to get the confession. The two begin fighting and crash through a wall onto a nearby movie set.
Piss on you. I'm working for Mel Brooks, not in the face.
Mysterio attempts using another smokescreen in order for Peter to use his spider sense to land a knockout blow. Beck is turned over to the cops along with the recorded confession, and an embarrassed J. Jonah Jameson heads back to the Daily Bugle, where he's greeted by numerous pictures that Peter took of the fight, which are enough to cover the Parker's bills for at least a few months.
It's now time for Spidey to meet his most iconic foe in the Green Goblin. Now, look, I think everyone knows who the Green Goblin is, but at the point of his introduction, his identity is supposed to be a secret, and it's kept that way for a number of years, so we're just going to be referring to him as the Goblin or the Green Goblin throughout this. So join us as we see the Green Goblin pop up alongside the Incredible Hulk and also the Enforcers. Damn it! I thought we were through with those guys.
Montana, Fancy Dan, and Angst receive a visit from a goblin-costumed individual on a broom-like rocket. He's willing to aid them in entrapping Spider-Man, but they need just the right idea to do so. The Goblin then flies over to the offices of movie producer B.J. Cosmos to pitch a movie where he and the Enforcers take on Spidey. Cosmos flips out on the idea and immediately greenlights the project. After that, the Goblin lures the wall crawler out with a stunt on the radio. The promise of a $50,000 payday is just too much for Spidey to turn down, and he accepts, with Peter Parker being assigned to photograph the behind-the-scenes action in Hollywood.
And of course, by Hollywood, they mean Vancouver, British Columbia.
Early on in shooting, the Goblin and the Enforcers want to run through a fight scene with Spider-Man. However, Ox doesn't pull his punches, making Peter realize that he's been had. The Goblin interferes by dropping several explosives, which disorients Spidey, driving him into a nearby cave. Inside, Spider-Man is able to utilize the environment to get back at his attackers. However, all the commotion has roused the cave's actual occupant, the Incredible Hulk. The Green Behemoth believes that Spidey is trying to bring him in and is far too strong for the wall crawler. Finally, Spider-Man lures the Hulk to the cave entrance, which the Enforcers had blocked with a boulder earlier, and Hulk manages to crash through, giving them a chance to exit, as Spidey ducks into a small pool. As the Hulk wanders off, the Goblin gets away, and Peter rounds up the rest of the Enforcers to turn them over to the authorities. Of course, the film is now scuttled, and thanks to not having a contract, Spider-Man only gets bus fare ride back to New York City.
I keep telling you people, pay or play!
Spider-Man manages to catch a group of people planning a bank robbery. He manages to encapsulate all but one, who it turns out is none other than the Chameleon. The master cosplayer is still stinging from his previous encounter with the wall crawler and decides to call in a favor from an old acquaintance, Kraven the Hunter.
The fact that the Kraven and the Chameleon are actually half-brothers isn't revealed until much later. So just for now, Kraven is a renowned big game hunter.
Kraven arrives in New York City to much fanfare and a brief display of his abilities when some guerrillas attempt to escape. The excitement is so much that Peter Parker isn't able to take any pics, because he was actually trying to change into a Spider-Man outfit, and that gets him ripped by Jameson and some attention from Liz, much to Betty's dismay. Kraven manages to meet up with the Chameleon, who turns over all of his collected information on Spider-Man, and soon the Hunter is slowly stalking the wall crawler. Of course, Spidey can detect Kraven's presence with his spider sense. However, upon confronting the Hunter, Spidey's arm is completely neutralized by a nerve pinch, giving him a completely dead arm. Spider-Man avoids any further attacks and manages to get away, just barely managing to grab his camera as he does. Peter manages to get back to Queens and spends the rest of the night trying to heal up. He wakes up with most of his arm back in use, but with Aunt May constantly now trying to set him up on a date with her neighbor's unseen niece. The awkwardness continues at the office as Betty gives Peter a cold reception, and then Kraven suddenly barges out of Jameson's office after a meeting. Unfortunately, whatever he was proposing to the publisher was borderline illegal, so Jameson wanted none of it. However, the sight of seeing Kraven again causes Peter to begin losing control of his hand once more. Peter is now so flustered that he can't even function at school properly and gets sent home. On the plus side, this does get him excused from the date, for now. Peter takes his newfound spare time to make another spider tracer in order to hunt the Hunter and heads out web-slinging. He spots Kraven and manages to get the tracer on him, only for Kraven to have thought this out in advance and had the Chameleon wearing a Kraven disguise. Kraven manages to tangle Spider-Man up in a net and then places two armaments on Peter's arm and leg, which wind up weighing him down. Spider-Man wriggles free of the net and manages to neutralize the armaments by emptying his webbing canisters into both of them. This enables him to take out the Chameleon and then turn his attention to Kraven, who he eventually winds up tangling in a giant web. The two are arrested by the police and wind up getting deported, but Peter Parker is still having trouble with women. Meanwhile, Dr. Octopus continues to stew in his jail cell. He's been separated physically from his arms, but he can still operate them telepathically and manages to utilize them to escape with a new plan. Spider-Man gets word of this escape just as he's bugged by Thor on his way to his Avengers meeting. Things get worse for Peter as Flash Thompson begins to challenge him to a fight, only for Doctor Strange to suddenly intercede, which terrifies the bully. Dr. Octopus assembles Electro, Mysterio, Kraven, the Vulture, and the Sandman to form a group to finally take down Spider-Man. They have two options. They could have all 6 members of this group take him on at the same time and just overwhelm him, or they could do something a bit more stupid and just take him on one at a time.
Yeah, they chose the stupid version and drew numbers.
Meanwhile, the accumulating stress in Peter Parker's life is beginning to affect his spider powers, which glitch out and nearly cause him to fall to his death. He manages to make his way home and begins wallowing in self-pity, even going as far as to skip out on school the next day. The school contacts Aunt May, and she heads over to the Daily Bugle to see if Betty Brant knows anything. However, at that very moment, Dr. Octopus has implemented his plan by having Sandman and Electro abduct Betty, and thus by extension May as well, which gets witnessed by J. Jonah Jameson. He manages to get in contact with Peter, and the two are soon visited by the Vulture, with news that Betty and May will be freed when Spider-Man turns himself over to this new group calling itself the Sinister Six. With no other choice, Peter suits up and heads off to an electric plant to take on Electro with no powers. As that plays out, Dr. Octopus begins sweet-talking Aunt May.
Yes, the bizarre feelings that Aunt May seems to have for Dr. Octopus do become a running thread throughout the Spider-Man comics, with the two even becoming engaged at one point.
As he dodges a few electrical blasts, Peter's powers suddenly come back to him, and it gives him the chance to get the drop on the living battery and drop him with a thunderous bolo punch. He then finds a note leading to the next villain, who turns out to be Kraven. Kraven is at the zoo, and he's released several large cats to take on Spidey. However, he's easily able to avoid them and grab the note leading to the next villain.
And, Kraven, I guess, is just allowed to roam around freely.
The clue leads to what appears to be the X-Men, who immediately begin attacking Spider-Man. Of course, these are just constructs by Mysterio, who gets taken out when Spider-Man crashes into the control room. It's there that he finds the next clue, which leads to the Sandman. Spidey literally has to move through the villain to get to the next clue, however that triggers a trap that traps the two inside a giant airtight chamber. The Sandman may have control of the area, but air supply soon burns up and he collapses, allowing Spider-Man to escape. That leaves the Vulture, who gives up Doc Ock's location once Spidey takes out the gyroscope for his wing harness. The mansion where Dr. Octopus is keeping Betty and Aunt May is sprawling, and that allows the villain to lure Spider-Man into a large water tank battle, so it's like fighting an actual octopus. However, Spidey manages to win by tangling up Ock's tentacles and some webbing. Spider-Man manages to escape and manages to free Betty and Aunt May, the latter of whom is quite upset at the brutish manner of Spider-Man, and also because she missed that night's episode of the Beverly Hillbillies, and Tubi hasn't been invented yet.
The Sinister Six really wouldn't appear again until the mid-1980s with a slightly different lineup, as Kraven had died and the Sandman had reformed at that point. There will be many lineups throughout the years, even including the likes of the Hobgoblin and Venom. Yeah, Venom.
Spider-Man is out web-slinging when he spots a group of muggers accosting a blind man. This is no ordinary blind man, however, but rather attorney Matt Murdock, a.k.a. Daredevil. He does thank Spidey for the rescue before slipping away to get back to his office, Nelson and Murdock. Matt overhears Foggy Nelson and Kieran Page making plans to attend the circus that evening, but opts out of joining them because, blind. That changes when the circus begins advertising an appearance by Spider-Man as a performer. So Matt elects to join Kieran and Foggy, while an intrigued Peter Parker also buys a ticket, forgetting he get 2 tickets, meaning he can't take Betty, who's now even more upset with him. Thinking that this is all for charity, Peter changes into a Spider-Man outfit and does a few tricks for the crowd. That all changes when the Ringmaster activates a device on his hat that hypnotizes not only Spider-Man, but the audience as well, save for Matt Murdock because, blind.
This is the Circus of Crime, a group we actually covered all the way back in episode 15 of the Random Trade Review, aka Volume 1 of the Incredible Hulk Masterworks. Again, there's not really too much to say here. Their most noteworthy fact is that a young Clint Barton, aka Hawkeye from the Avengers, was once part of the group, but other than that, they don't even warrant a full Wikipedia article. They just have a giant list of Marvel villains.
Matt suits up as Daredevil, and the Ringmaster orders Spider-Man to fight his fellow vigilante, while his underlings pick the pockets of the audience. However, Daredevil is able to lead Spider-Man in a large circle back to the Ringmaster, knocking off his hypno hat in the process. Matt then picks the hat up and deprograms Spider-Man, explaining that the hypnosis doesn't work when your eyes are closed. The two then team up to take down the circus and deprogram the audience. Later, Matt Murdock explains to Foggy and Karen that he fell asleep due to the circus not exactly being entertaining to someone who really can't see it. He then, as a joke, he offers his legal services to the Ringmaster as the cops lead him away. He's modified his broom rocket into an honest-to-goodness goblin glider and developed razor bats, a frog-shaped fog bomb, and of course his trademark pumpkin bombs. Back at Midtown High, Peter overhears Flash Thompson announcing the formation of a Spider-Man fan club that he hopes will surpass the fan club run by the Human Torch. Flash reluctantly winds up inviting Peter to the first meeting at Liz Allen's behest, as her father is footing the bill for all this. An unsure Peter slinks away and heads home, spotting what appears to be a bank robbery on the way, only for Spider-Man to find out that this was a movie the whole time. All this does for Peter is bring up memories of the Green Goblin, who, unbeknownst to Spidey, has actually been watching the wall crawler from an unseen civilian persona. Things don't exactly pick up for Peter, as a chance to walk Betty home is interrupted by Liz and Flash buying an ad for the Spider-Man fan club, which the Green Goblin then reads when he gets back to his lair. Back at home, Aunt May is once again trying to set Peter up on a date with her neighbor Anna Watson's niece named Mary Jane. Thankfully, Peter is able to slip away to the fan club meeting, which has not only attracted the attention of J. Jonah Jameson and Betty Brant, but also of Johnny Storm the Human Torch. Peter suits up and does a few tricks as Spider-Man for the club, and it's at that moment that the Green Goblin attacks. The Goblin reveals he can also fire energy blasts from the fingers of his gloves as Spidey dodges a variety of attacks. Even the Human Torch winds up joining the fray, which gives ample enough time for Peter to slip away as Spider-Man, change back into Peter Parker, appear as himself, and get seen by Betty having Liz adjust his hair. Peter then manages to rejoin the battle as Spider-Man, but then everything comes to a halt when he overhears a phone call saying that his Aunt May has suffered a heart attack. Spider-Man runs off, leaving the Torch to deal with the Goblin, who just leaves, and everyone is dismayed that Spider-Man ran away rather than confront the Goblin, meaning that he can't possibly be a hero, and that J. Jonah Jameson is right. Aunt May is in stable condition, but it does little to pick up Peter's spirits, as he suddenly realizes that now everyone thinks he's a coward. As Spider-Man's reputation continues to be dragged through the mud, the other heroes and even a few villains react with disgust at his cowardly actions. The only person who's happy is J. Jonah Jameson, who seems to now have a smile permanently affixed to his face, which terrifies everyone. That being said, the Wallcrawler still has one defender, a very fervent Flash Thompson. Making things worse, even though May is back from the hospital, all of this has put even more strain on the Parkers' meager finances. Peter tries to reconnect with the Daily Bugle, but Betty just won't talk to him. Finally, he actually physically goes to the Bugle to confront Betty, but she just tells him to go be with Liz. Then, as a last-ditch effort, Peter pays a visit to a science corporation as Spider-Man to try to get his webbing patented. It is a super strong adhesive, however it's temporary, meaning there's absolutely no money in it, so that's just a dead end. Shortly after that, Spider-Man runs right into the Sandman, who's still looking for a rematch after the Sinister 6 experience. Again, Spider-Man just bolts and eludes the villain as the ever-smiling J. Jonah Jameson looks on as more and more people begin to come to his side.
On the plus side, our recovered Aunt May has moved on trying to set Peter up with her neighbor, Mrs. Watson's niece, has instead moved on to trying to set up Peter with her other neighbor, Mrs. Watkins' niece. That's obviously a different person and not just a printing error.
Desperately seeking answers, Johnny Storm skywrites a message asking for Spider-Man to meet him on top of the Statue of Liberty, where the two have met frequently.
Okay, so around this time, Johnny Storm was not only a member of the Fantastic Four, but he also had the occasional solo adventures in the anthology Strange Tales. I believe Peter Parker popped up as Spider-Man in a couple of them, but outside of like the previous, or the issue that came out just before the issue we're covering, I'm not entirely sure as to when that was, or how deep their relationship exactly is. It's not part of this collection.
Everything changes when a distraught Liz visits Peter. Flash was so dead set on proving that Spider-Man is a hero that he's actually gone out dressed as the Wallcrawler to fight crime. Peter rushes out to try to stop him, however he immediately comes across Flash getting beaten up by a group of muggers, and he can't intercede without giving up his identity, so he just has to wait for the cops to arrive. They manage to round up the muggers, and they also wind up bringing in the concussed Flash for being an idiot. The next day at school, everyone mocks Flash for his shiner that he got from this little stunt, and he winds up attacking Peter, who is actually trying to offer him some comfort. Dejected, Peter heads back to the Daily Bugle to see if he can scrounge up any photography assignments, and it's then that he immediately spots Betty going out on a date with another guy. Peter then slinks back home, ready to completely abandon being Spider-Man. That all changes when Aunt May decides that she's strong enough to attempt walking, and when Peter tries to talk her out of it, May snaps and points out, "You just don't give up because something bad happened." This is enough to inspire Peter to return to being Spider-Man and set out to try to redeem his name.
And the first step to that redemption, which is the last issue of this collection, features Spider-Man going up against the Sandman once again and his new cronies, the Enforcers.
No! God, please, no! No! No!
Spider-Man breaks up a bank robbery, making mincemeat of the robbers in front of a large crowd. Word soon gets back to J. Jonah Jameson, who loses his smile, meaning he'll have to forfeit the WWF Championship. Meanwhile, Johnny Storm is jumped by the Sandman and the Enforcers, with Fancy Dan using a fire extinguisher on the torch before the Sandman just smothers him. The group then place Johnny in an oxygen-free chamber so he can't flame on again.
Or, breathe.
After school, Peter notices Fancy Dan walking by and decides to suit up as Spider-Man in order to track the criminal to his hideout. However, this turns out to be a complete trap as the whole building is filled with goons waiting to attack Spider-Man. The police arrive and scuttle the battle before Spidey can get overwhelmed, so he manages to slip out and head back to the Daily Bugle, where he's formally introduced to Betty's new companion, investigative reporter Ned Leeds. Peter has accepted that Betty's moved on before a welcomingly irate J. Jonah Jameson demands more Spider-Man pictures.
I mean, it's not like Betty and Ned are going to get married and have that marriage suddenly fall into the strain of Ned constantly investigating organized crime activities, driving Betty into the arms of Flash Thompson for an affair, only for Ned to then be killed thinking he's a supervillain thanks to the machinations of like 3 to 4 other supervillains. What were we talking about again?
It's then that word of the Human Torch's disappearance gets out, and an informant tells Spider-Man that the Sandman and Enforcers were involved. Spider-Man then makes his way to the group's actual hideout, only for the Sandman to be laying in wait on top of the Torch's chamber. Johnny shouts out assistance as the foursome gang up on the wall crawler. Still, it takes Spider-Man cannonballing into the tube in order to free the Torch and turn the tide. It's then that the police arrive to take down all the bad guys, and thankfully Peter has enough pictures to pay off the next few months of bills. Still, much of this is not going unnoticed, as a strange man has begun tailing Peter Parker after work and on his way home from school. It turns out this person is being employed by an unseen benefactor who needs to know everything before he can properly act.
And that concludes our look at Volume 2 of the Marvel Masterworks, The Amazing Spider-Man. How was it? Well, I think there's a lot of good action-packed storytelling in this. There's some very nice characterization with some good character banter, mixed with very nice pathos throughout the storytelling. And of course, all of this is coupled with some very top-notch artwork from Steve Ditko. If there is a drawback, it's that sometimes, and again, this is due to the storytelling nature of the time, things can get a little repetitive. Especially the annual issue, which is the Sinister 6 story, that really gets repetitive because we're constantly bouncing between Jameson worried about Betty Brant, and then Peter going after these villains, and then Betty and May at Doc Ock's mansion, and then it's like that causes some of the fight scenes, which probably should have been way more padded out, to just be done quickly. Again, like the Kraven fight. It just ends. Like, he gets the piece and then moves on, leaving Kraven completely unattended. And, I said this before, but, yeah, the Enforcers are just not interesting. It's like, the fact that we got them for 2 more stories in this, and it's like, wow, someone really must have thought they were going to be popular, because, like, they get their own feature, they get their, like, in the annual, they get their own, like, section describing who they are, and it's like, these are important characters, and it's like, no one cares about these guys. Like, I don't even think the storytelling cares about these guys, because they just contribute nothing. They're just guys with slight gimmicks. I know that, like, all the villains technically have gimmicks, but their gimmicks are, yeah, just nothing. And again, even though there's not really much in the way of like political incorrectness in this at all. You fancy Dan, maybe. Other than that, like I said, it is still very much of its time, so you do have to kind of adjust yourself to certain styles of storytelling and actions that probably wouldn't be done today. Again, I kind of talk a little bit about Betty and Peter's quasi-relationship crossing some boundaries, but yeah, like that was sort of given then, not necessarily good, but acceptable, especially that type of storytelling, than it would be nowadays, where, yeah, you would be getting in a lot of trouble for it, even with their age not being that much different. But still, like I said, those are mostly nitpicks. Again, you're in for some really good fun reading these stories. I am aware that the Marvel Masterworks line is currently on hiatus, but these issues are readily available. They're issues 11 through 19 and the annual, which is the Sinister 6 story, like I said before. Like I said, they're readily available. There's a big omnibus. You can get the issues on like Marvel Unlimited, Comixology Unlimited. So yeah, you can find them. It's not that hard. I'm going to be giving Volume 2 of the Marvel Masterworks The Amazing Spider-Man an A. And with that, let's see what you're doing next time on the Random Trade Review.
Hey guys, remember you can support my work at patreon.com/CP Time for Cat Productions, where you can even request a trade to be put in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box. Also, remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so that you can be notified for further videos.